I am so excited to be here, not just for the topic, but also because I get to talk to two of my favorite people, um, and they are Lawrence Grand Prix and Christina Meneses. And I hope that you both will just take some time to introduce yourselves. So let's start with Christina.
Hi, everyone. Thank you for coming. I'm excited to be here. I am, like Adar said, Christina Meneses, and I am the director of the clinical law program here at the University of Maryland School of Law. I've been an attorney for, I don't know, a long time, 16 years, I believe. And I've worked as a public defender, I've done legal aid, and I've done healthcare law. So I've seen a little bit of everything. And I hope that the discussion tonight will uh, really talk about how we could meet the challenges of today. Oh, and also, I almost forgot, I am on the BRJ Advisory Committee, which I love and adore, and been part of BRJ for 15 years.
And for 15 years, I have been pronouncing your last name wrong.
That's all right. Everybody does it.
Okay, correction, correction. And Lawrence, welcome.
Good evening, Lawrence Grand Prix, Director of Research for Leaders of a Beautiful Struggle. We're a grassroots think tank. Um, we work on a variety of issues, including reparations for the war on drugs, which I think will serve as the basis for some of the connections we want to draw between anti-Black policing and increased border enforcement and the Showed Me Your Papers phenomenon that we're here to talk about today.
Awesome. I am so appreciative of both the scholarship and the analysis that you all bring. And I want to say hi to everyone who is joining us. And I encourage you to put questions, comments, add your insights into the chat comments so that we can see where you all are with this topic too. I want to start out with you, Lawrence, because um, even though the mainstream and some alternative media has been framing this concept of show your papers as something that is distinctly new to US society, you have spoken more than once about how this is not a new phenomenon, but in fact is just about as old as the United States of America itself. Can you say more about that?
Yeah. So I think like many people seeing hearing the story about what happened in Chicago where police used Black Hawk helicopters to basically rappel into a apartment building that they believed had undocumented immigrants there and took people out of their apartments, their homes, many of whom were in pajamas, some of whom were naked, some of whom were children, and detained them, put them in vans, and it was talked about as this unprecedented American historical moment. And while deeply impactful, it just came to mind. It's like, well, anyone who remembers what is happening now, which is the SWAT team raids with the war on drugs, knows that very similar things that happen very, very consistently in the Black community. Um, and it have historically been happening in America for a very long time. So I believe one of the most clear connections is this idea of slave passes, where white people who could deputize themselves formally or informally as law enforcement officers would check the papers of Black people to, if you were Black and enslaved in the South, you could, go between plantations to do errands for your the person who bought you, and you only could have that freedom if you were given written permission by the slave owner. And so this internal surveillance system of coercing and policing bodies and controlling their movements have a long tradition before the contemporary moment of it being tied to illegal immigration status. And I think criminal status is such a central reality because the nature of the link between immigration law being that white immigrants from places like Ireland were basically deemed legal immigrants and therefore allowed to have essentially freedom of mobility, though they were, of course, economically exploited. versus nations that are blacker and browner in the contemporary moment post-immigration reforms where that immigration is criminalized, right? But it's the same economic migration phenomenon, just one deemed legal, one deemed illegal. And then you, of course, look to, the long history of coercive mobility and coercion through the criminal legal system. So you have, slave passes. Oh, I'm sorry, you have prisoner furlough passes, Dukakis in the 88 election. You had to prove your worth if you were incarcerated for a drug charge or a violent crime charge that would be overlooked in the white community to even get access to community opportunities. But if one person, i.e. Willie Horton, commits a crime on that furlough, then the entire program is coerced, surveilled. That even things contemporaneously with the rise of electronic surveillance, people ankle monitors, where as part condition of your release in the criminal legal system, you can basically be told if we find you in a known drug trafficking area, that will be deemed a violation of your probation. And just understand that if you are from a community that's been targeted by police enforcement, it shreds the ability of the community to create alternatives to drug trafficking sometimes as an economic opportunity. So they've just criminalized you returning to your home or you returning to the community where you know people. And your mere desire to connect to people who you know and love is therefore a criminal act. And if you cannot show people, like your PO gives you permission to go to a jobs program in a certain community, then you're in violation of your probation. They can electronically monitor you. And in this moment where electronic monitoring and home detention is deemed as a social justice alternative to mass incarceration, it just shows you the failure of the so-called liberal reformist wing of the Democratic Party to not only take account of this show me your papers phenomenon, but really to lean into it and to buy into it as almost a reformist tactic as compared to just broad-based working windows mass incarceration. And it's almost as if the two sides need each other, where one side's openly, overtly genocidal and violent, but the other side seeks this coercive system of surveillance and paperwork and bureaucracy and technocracy. This is really a liberal phenomenon, is what I'm saying. So we as political folks have to take account for that and really be able to reckon with that in terms of our relationship to politics and solutions.
Thank you. And before we jump to Christina, because Christina, I want to ask you to talk us through more of that legal history of it. But even before we go there, Lawrence, if you can speak to the other side of just the historical perspective, which is what we have seen going on for the last couple of years now, where any citizen, even if they do not have any type of state authority, they're not in positions of state authority. If you are white, you can demand that anybody show their papers. And if they don't, then it's like you have some carte blanche to detain them, to shoot them, and then you can just say, I was just afraid for my life. Do you see that as having seeped into the culture of the United States so much that anybody that whiteness, right, gives carte blanche to be an authority of the state, and blackness specifically, and brown looking like an immigrant means that you automatically have to bow down to the authority of whiteness, even if it is a person without any type of state authority?
Yeah, so part of the unifying structure is, Naomi Murakami wrote this book, The First Civil Right. And that is based on the concept where the first right as an American is to be free from the fear of violent crime. So we have a liberal interpretation of what brings us mass incarceration, which is fear of violent crime. And the right to be safe in your body, therefore, justifies white people arming themselves, justifies George Zimmerman, justifies militias, justifies extreme extrajudicial surveillance, ring cameras, just the surveillance ecosystem we have is all justified by, people deserve to feel safe. And every liberal politician has basically been using this talking point. People deserve to feel safe. But no understanding that within the context of America, no understanding of the fundamental violation of Black and brown humanity.
Mm.
That impetus of safety is therefore justification for almost unlimited extrajudicial rights claiming amongst the white citizenry and human rights abuses amongst Black folk. So you see this where, again, Rittenhouse, the white kid who took the automatic weapon to the protest and shot the person, basically gets taken, like basically the National Guard wove him through, basically almost as if he was like a deputized National Guard at that moment when Black people were protesting and he had his automatic weapon, right? So there is just this, impunity from prosecuting white folks that commit acts of vigilante violence, impunity from prosecuting ICE when they do things like shoot a woman they claim was ramming an ICE car and had a gun, but looks like didn't. And of course, impunity from police when they commit extra legal violence against Black bodies, but they also just legalize the violence, right? So it's important that the legal solution is, the reality is, whether it's a Castle Doctrine, stand your ground laws, we have an entire legal edifice for both police violence and civilian violence against Black bodies, claiming self-defense. Skittles and Arizona iced tea can were at least a weapon in the context of Trayvon Martin, George Zimmerman. So this reality of within their bodies, white people feeling unsafe instantaneously creates a literal legal justification for extrajudicial violence.
Mm.
Really shows the need to both focus on the legal apparatus, but also understand the legal apparatus was baked in America's foundation to justify that extra legal violence as a tool of deterrence for perceived unruly Black and brown bodies.
Thank you. And Christina, talking about that legal apparatus, what is your take on that? Unmute.
So thank you, Lawrence. I think he does a fantastic job really laying out the historical perspective of how we're here today. Because I think that it just is one building block on top of another to get us to where we are today. And I think when we're talking about how the law in the legal system, and like I said, I've been an attorney and practiced within the system. I've done all types of work within the legal system, is that we're all coming from a basis where, and we're taught in law school and we're taught in all of our continuing education and all of the rest of it, that our legal system is colorblind. That is a fundamental response, that people under the law should be treated the same no matter what. But we know that, essentially, this is a legal fiction. And we kind of all, deep down in our hearts know it's a legal fiction. And we still go to the system to try to seek justice and reparations and some type of undoing of the systemic racism that the United States is known for. So it's a matter of recognizing that and then trying to undo that. But the undoing is the difficult part because it is such a well-crafted system that is meant to oppress people. That's how we were founded. And I think to say, oh, that happened a long time ago, we don't do that anymore, is a lie. I think it's just a matter of how we've built upon it. So starting with, as Lawrence mentioned, folks who were enslaved having to show their papers when they were traveling, that's kind of like the origin. We baked that in. And then we got a little bit more fanciful with it. And within the last 20, 30 years, we've really put it into action and codified it, meaning we made it a law. We made it part of the process. So you could see it all kind of start with what they called illegal immigration or illegal aliens taking over. And there's always this sense of fear mongering, which is also part of it. And talking to what Lawrence was saying about this safety issue and how we understand that. So one of the aspects that we see the starting of the Show Your Papers is through 287G agreements that were essentially the federal government reached out to different states and different localities, police precincts, and said, under the law, what you could do is we're going to give you some federal funds so that you too are deputized to handle illegal immigration in your communities. So picking up undocumented individuals. And we're going to give you money to do that. And now you have the power that the federal government has. And those for like the immigration is something that's usually left to the federal government. That's the federal government's jurisdiction, in other words. So police departments at the state level, local community sheriffs, things like that, they typically didn't have that power to pick up and hold people for the mere fact of being undocumented. So this is the first, not the first, this is kind of like the next stage of where we've legalized it and made it part of our legal system, where now communities were given money to do this work. So police departments who would say that they were underfunded or that they didn't have the right equipment, now are saying we're getting money from the federal government. We're also getting equipment. So that's why our police has all of these resources to now look like the military. That is something that came out of the extra funds, and there's other funding mechanisms that they've used over the course of time. And much of the funding mechanisms is really based on also oppressing people who are Black and brown. So another funding mechanism, to give you an example of that, has nothing to do with immigration, is the use of public benefits. And what, at some points, the federal government incentivized the police departments to call and round up people who allegedly were taking either SNAP benefits and who were illegally collecting them. So they would make people sign off that they were illegally receiving SNAP benefits. And a piece of that recouped money was then given to police departments or the state's attorney's office to fund some of their programs. So you could see, so this is kind of a different area of law, but you could see that people have been really using this federal state partnership in a way to get at people where they're at. So they're much more localized. People in the communities know where people who are undocumented are living and community resources. So the idea was that the federal government gave the local police department money under the 287G agreements. Some states took it up. I think it was about 36 states have a relationship like that. It can be more, it can be less. It depends on who is running that particular state and whether they agree to it or not. So Arizona, we all know of the sheriff down there. I'm not even going to mention his name; doesn't deserve screen time. Who went around and made it his particular personal life to go after undocumented individuals and make their lives miserable and incarcerate them. So that was where you kind of see that the use of those resources being targeted at immigrants and people coming into the country without regard to whether they came in, as they say, legally or illegally. That's when you kind of start seeing the racial profiling and there's cases all over the country that illustrate that you're not supposed to stop someone just because they look a certain way. That's what we say. That's kind of what we are as a country agreed on, a set of rules. Like there should be probable cause. We have the Fourth Amendment that prevents being held and searched without cause. There has to be some articulable, reasonable suspicion, which is like essentially a legal term that says there has to be a particular reason why you're stopping this person. They can't just be doing nothing and you just want to get in their business. You have to believe that there's going to be an imminent crime about to happen. So, and there's a lot of conversation about the Fourth Amendment and what that means, and a lot of legal scholars pontificate about that. But for the everyday practice of what we need is to understand that no one should be stopping you on the street just because. No police should stop you just because. And the state shouldn't be acting upon you to limit your freedom. And that's what a detainer is. Like, stopping you is stopping you from moving freely. So we as a country all agree that this is something that's important. We have this amendment and this is where we're at. So 287 kind of started shaking that foundation and essentially giving folks the ability in police departments the ability to start stopping people. And at that point, people were under the communities were under the belief that it's the criminal act that's stopping folks. But we all know through multiple lawsuits, and I mean, probably hundreds of lawsuits that came about, that 287G agreements were being used to target, to racial profile individuals. So that's kind of like where we're at. Those agreements are still in place. So there's counties and states that have 287G agreements in place and that are active and alive. And in fact, under this administration, they were trying to force states to take up these agreements as well. So you saw this and you see it on the news all the time that that under this administration, that the pressures being applied on blue states to do more policing, and that's where the National Guard's showing up, and that's where all of these kind of military actions of policing your own communities is taking place. And at this point, like, the National Guards are being called from different states to go to a blue state and whatnot. So it's just a matter of now the pressure is put on to try to get more agreements between the states and the federal government, so that the states could bend to the will of the federal government and essentially pick up undocumented individuals. That's where we kind of were. And then just about a month ago, and it was, let's see, September 8th, the Supreme Court came. So this isn't interesting because it's not really a case. It was part of the shadow docket, and it's
Christina, can you explain what a shadow document is and how that's different?
Yes. Okay. So for the Supreme Court to get a case, that means that across the country there were different cases percolating up through the trial level and then the appellate level, and after the appellate level, someone is petitioning for the Supreme Court to review it. And that happens, and there has to be a disagreement between the states of how to apply the law. So just because someone disagrees with it, just because like a plaintiff disagrees with the outcome or the defendant disagrees with the outcome, and that doesn't mean it's going to go up to the Supreme Court. There has to be some disagreement in other jurisdictions for the court to take up the question. And sometimes it doesn't on some other cases. So it's not absolute. But to say that so that's kind of how the progression goes. And it's a long process, very long. So for example, like marriage equality was one where you saw some states allowed it, some states didn't. And then it kind of percolated up through the appellate court. The appellate court reviewed, and then the plaintiff petitioned the Supreme Court for an ultimate review. And the Supreme Court is essentially the law of the land. So once the Supreme Court rules on a particular case, that's before them. And that means that it's been briefed. They have all of the information that's related to the trial. They have all of the arguments that were made. They have oral arguments based on the case. They come before the Supreme Court, and it all happens together. So all of those pieces come together, and then the justices weigh on the decision and they come with their vote essentially as to how to rule on the law. So once they make that decision, that becomes the rule of the law. So back in the day with marriage equality, but once again, as an example, once the Supreme Court made the decision, then marriage controlled the entire United States. So same-sex people who were in a relationship wanted to get married were able to marry across the country. So that's how typically it works. It's a lot of work, takes a long time. Now, the shadow docket, or it's called, I think the true term is like the emergency docket, is supposed to be for moments in our country where there's such a pressing legal issue that the court needs to do something immediately before something goes, there's incredible harm. So cases are petitions, and for this, under this administration, they have petitioned the Supreme Court multiple times And let me tell you, I feel like we've lived a whole lifetime, but it really hasn't. It's only been what are we now? 9 months, something like that, 10 months of this. And it feels like a lifetime. But they have petitioned the court several times for this under this emergency docket situation. For the emergency docket, they don't have a clear record. There hasn't been any trial for this particular case. There hasn't been a trial yet. It was just based on an injunction. And injunctions they're serious in the legal world. An injunction is serious because you're saying you can't act a particular way at this particular time. But they're usually short-lived until there's a full-blown trial and that there's evidence presented, witnesses, experts if need be, briefing. All of that takes place at trial. But that wasn't the case here. In this case, it's let me see, Pedro Vasquez Perdomo is the individual that one of the named individuals in the case. And he is someone who is an immigrant. And for this particular case, there was just a 2-week injunction. The trial was scheduled more for the hearing on the merits was scheduled for sometime in September after the Supreme Court made their decision. So this is getting in the weeds. So let me back up a little bit so it could kind of make it a little bit easier. So they took up the issue of the stay. The appeals court said that there could be an injunction in place that the ICE agents were not allowed to use 4 factors to arrest someone who they perceived to be undocumented. The moral of the story: all those 4 documents are based on racial profiling. It was, what you look like. If you look like an immigrant, if you speak a different language, if you're speaking English but with an accent, that's also one of the factors. And it goes through and where you're working. So if you're working at a Home Depot, if you're working at a car wash, if you're standing at a bus stop, all those things, those 4 factors were an indication that gives the ICE officer enough to detain you and stop you and question. So the injunction was in place. The courts at the lower level said, no, this is illegal. This is racial profiling. We don't do that here in the United States. We're not down with it. But the administration petitioned the Supreme Court, and then the Supreme Court, Kavanaugh, issues a small, and the emergency docket doesn't require any written order. They just come out with an order and they tell the courts how to proceed. Well, in this case, Kavanaugh issued a small written, I guess decision, we'll call it that for lack of a better word, because there wasn't really a case to review, saying that it's okay because it's okay for ICE to stop people who meet these 4 factors because we know that immigration there's a greater harm if the government doesn't stop this. So the greater harm is economic and safety concerns. So that was one of the kind of standards of review that they used that in making this decision. And then he goes on to say that statistically speaking, where certain people hang out. So that in and of itself is an indication that they're undocumented. And this goes back to what Lawrence was saying about where people hang out. You hang out with your family, your friends, your community. That's where you're hanging out. So they're once again using that as a cover for arresting folks where they live and enjoy their community and find their support. Mm-hmm. And he says these detainers are short-lived. All you got to do is basically tell ICE that you are a U.S. citizen or here documented, so you have some type of status, and they're going to let you go. So that is, as you could all see it all play out on the nightly news, is that's not the case. And this court, Sonia Sotomayor, gives an incredible takedown of all of the arguments that Kavanaugh makes and really goes through and says, the abuse that's happening And the fact that now you're saying this is okay to racially profile. And she doesn't say racially profile because I think that would probably be a step too far for her. But she's making note that these areas are so it's so blatant what's happening that now we're making second class citizens of people who are seen a certain way. So, I'll stop there just to say that what this does, it's not a legal decision that covers the entire nation, but it does embolden, empower, and encourage ICE to behave in a particular way. And not just ICE, let's be honest about it. This is going to embolden, empower law enforcement to police and continue to oppress Black and brown bodies. And if you look a certain way, you are going to fall victim to that.
And again, not just law enforcement, because what strikes me about this entire conversation is that what we see now is built upon what the history of this country has been. So everything that was okay to do to African descendants, to Native Americans, which has been the bulk of US history, what has happened to Japanese Americans, to Chinese Americans, right? That we're once again saying, oh no, we're using this foundation, we're resurrecting this foundation in order to do this again. With what we see now, how is one to know whether the person who is stopping them are legitimate actors of the state, or just some random people running up in face mask and an unmarked car? I mean, it seems as if there are so many things that have been left open that puts everyone at risk, if this is the way in which business as usual is being conducted. But there's something that I heard in a little bit in both of your remarks that I want to ask about. Tell me whether I'm completely off base, but it seems as if money has something to do with this too. Money, the flow of money, federal monies to different states, other monies. And was I hearing that? Am I off base? What?
Lawrence,
Lawrence?
do you want to go first?
Yeah, I'll go first. So sometimes criminal justice advocates think that they're getting ahead of the game by making the argument about how much policing and incarceration costs, be it immigration policing, policing of cities, mass incarceration. And I think that misses the point because, to your point, Adar, it's an economic opportunity for someone. And it's not necessarily like private prisons. Private prisons make up a small percentage of the American policing system, but an increasingly large percentage of the immigration system. So that's part of it. The broader conceptual framework is that it's an investment in the psychic stability of an American population obsessed with essentially racial riot control. The assumptive logic is that the brown masses, be it because of being impoverished or seeking revenge for historical grievances, always has the capacity to unleash violence upon the quote-unquote civilized masses. That's why the police use the thin blue line. If you see a black rectangle with a blue line in the middle of it, that's the police symbol. Why is that the police symbol? Because the idea is that there are sheep and there are wolves, there are predators, and there's this thin blue line, just a few million cops that are protecting the millions of sheep from all the predators, and that's a racialized framework. So part of what we need to do is have a political intervention that both asserts the necessity of citizenship rights, Fourth Amendment rights, but also recognizes that Black and brown people were never intended to be in that citizenship category at the founding of the United States. So like the obsession with constitutional policing from the consent decree is understandable as a way to assert the demand that Black and brown people get a form of policing that respects their human rights. But there's also a point that some conservatives are making more openly now that racially profiling people is constitutional policing, because that was the intent of some of the founders. The intent of the founders was never to have a multiracial democracy. It was to have, this Herrenvolk democracy, this racially bifurcated democracy. And asserting that constitutional intent, that original framers' intent, allows them to revert to versions of basically eliminating people's citizenship status, and the protections that come with that. So it's important to assert politically to deal with the fear of crime that's associated with Black and brown bodies, the assumptive logic of drug dealing, the assumptive logic of gun carrying, where people are literally carrying guns now in part because they know that at any given moment, a masked, ununiformed agent of state violence could roll up on them and kidnap them. And also someone claiming to be a masked, ununiformed agent of state violence can rob them. So we're creating an environment where people are carrying guns to protect themselves. And as opposed to depending on the police to solve that, we have to invest in, and I think we'll hopefully talk about this later, though, whether it's Black people or brown people, people from the Latin diaspora or the African diaspora, specific cultural communal systems of policing, or of public safety, violence prevention, conflict mediation, that can ameliorate conflict, so that even if people are carrying guns, we don't have to rely on the police to lock people up for carrying a gun for self-defense in an environment where it is rational to carry said gun for self-defense, because of the rising fascism and the social forces of vigilantism and people pretending to be cops and robbing you that are rising because of that fascism. So it's investing in that violence prevention across different cultural political groups can create a sense of security where people aren't that's so desperate that they turn to a fascist police state to feel safe.
Thank you. Christina, what are your thoughts?
Well, another twist on the economical benefits of all this. There is a sense of, and the way it's articulated, and also just to point out that immigration detention is not supposed to be criminal detention. It's supposed to be a civil act, a civil way of dealing with this particular issue. But what we're seeing now is that it's more and more criminalized. And when you're taught, and that's by being detained in privately owned prisons and other places like that. What was it, Alligator, Alcatraz, or whatever they were calling it, things of that nature, where it's a punitive act. So they had reshaped the conversation from one that should have been a civil, and you don't have a right to an attorney in immigration cases because it's not criminal. You only have a right to an attorney when it's a criminal charge. So you have this place where there's money being made on the backs of these individuals for the system to hold its place, but also the messaging around the kidnapping, essentially, of these folks is the fact that they're saying, I'm trying to protect, the messaging is, I'm protecting your job because we want more Americans to have jobs. So they're essentially pitting the low income Black Americans, low income white Americans, low income individuals against each other, saying there's a scarcity of jobs and these illegal immigrants are coming here and taking them from you. And they're applying that across the board. So now you have this sentiment of hostility. So you have people now voting against their own self-interest because they bought into the idea that they're losing out because someone else is taking it from them. So it becomes an easy scapegoat in terms of the economy. So you're talking really about how, the price of groceries, we all know that. We all feel that every day. But now who are you blaming because of the price of groceries? You're saying this is brought on by the illegal immigrants. Now you have someone who you could pinpoint to and say they're to blame, not the overall structure of it. So it really leads to this this us against them mentality, this, even if I'm a them, I'm a different them. So I should be able to enjoy, and you see this a lot with like people who are either U.S. citizens, who are immigrants who are U.S. citizens, or who came through the legal way, and everybody else should come through that way too. So you have your own community. Like, let's take the Cubans in Miami, for example. A little moment. I'm Cuban. I'm a New York Cuban. I always like to say that up front. But I have lots of family in Miami, and a lot of them voted the way they voted, and they were like, well, they're going to protect us Cubans because they know how bad communism is, and Cuba is bad. And what we have now is this administration was like, oh, no, Cubans will not, Cubans and Venezuelans will not enjoy this special status. And the Cubans who voted for them are like, oh, wait a minute. I thought you were going to apply these laws to somebody else. I didn't think you were coming for my people. So at that point, what you have is now your family member is being deported, and you're like, oh, I voted for that. I'm sorry. And that's how we're decimating our own communities based on this false narrative that's being told to us.
So I want to spend some time just exploring that a bit because Lawrence, there's a quote that you said during another conversation that has just stuck with me, and that is when people are taken care of, they do not look for scapegoats. And Christina, what you're talking about with the scapegoating of different communities, and I was just on IG, right? And this happened a couple weeks ago. And so on IG, there was this guy who was Latino, and he put up a post saying, oh man, I didn't think that when I voted for him, he was talking about me and my people. And I used to think that Black people were exaggerating about everything that happened in their communities. But now it's happening to my family. And so I'm saying, oh man, I didn't know that. They weren't exaggerating. So this whole thing, I mean, it's such a perfect storm, right? There's the whole thing about oh, thank you for being here, Andrea. There's a whole thing about you know, different groups thinking that Black people have been exaggerating for generations. There's this whole thing of people who came as quote unquote legal immigrants thinking, well, you know, they're not talking about me, they're talking about these people who came over illegal. And so voting against the interest of people who, even with people with green cards who are waiting for, what is it, adjudication of that. And now all of a sudden, every step that they took to be here means nothing. And then you have, you know, the conflict between Black folk who may think that immigrants are coming to steal our jobs. And all of this is just like in this pot that can keep different communities that experience oppression at each other's throats instead of thinking about the other two things that I've heard you all talk about is how do we build bridges? How do we just keep the peace? Think about how we saw things going on in our own communities. How do we put those things in effect, right? So how do we move through this in order to build the bridges that we need to have in this moment? Thoughts?
Yeah, yeah. So I think it's useful to think about, I mean, I think so much of it starts with the war on drugs. Um, the war on drugs is a system of social economic control for Black America and Latin America, right? Where having states that can produce large amounts of cocaine and more recently heroin can create large amounts of money that people can funnel to things that are useful. So you have Iran-Contra, you know, funding foreign policy, basically, through off the books narco money. And you have, you know, Colombia basically being a a miniature version of Israel, basically, in South America, in terms of it being a base for American hegemony. And when we think about, again, like reparations for war on drugs, it's partially a response to, Black and brown communities are disproportionately incarcerated. So if you're distributing resources based upon the amount of cannabis arrests, like we do here in Maryland, in Baltimore, and then Black and brown communities can benefit from that. And then they can meet needs in their communities, so you don't have this economic competition, because, there is, systems that are being eviscerated now that were produced over decades of struggle to especially use access to public money to employ Black people through the Black Power movement, through the Voting Rights Act, through things like government contracts. Like when they cut the contract for the bridge, what did they claim? They claimed it was DEI, that they were doing minority hiring. And of course, the people who died on the bridge that collapsed were from the Latino community. So if you're creating opportunity where Black folks, don't feel as frustrated that people from the Latino community are getting access to those opportunities because there are other opportunities in that community, then that really undercuts an essential tool of economic competition that drives people against each other. And that also allows to deal with the potential for tensions between, especially young people. Young people of every race, of every generation, explore and push the boundaries and form groups that get into a variety of activity. So that can lead to things like, we're hearing stories about conflict in the schools that have disproportionately large Latino populations in Baltimore, like Digital Harbor or Patterson. And having groups that can actually go in and mediate those conflicts, violence prevention groups that can train together between the Black and brown community, that can get resources in the Black and brown community, and lastly, can build connections between places like victims of the war on drugs in Colombia, where many Black people went to get their drugs during the 80s and 90s and have like direct personal experience there, and build all those international connections to gain cultural competency. Again, to actually wrap up, these so-called gangs, again, this obsession with violent crime, so much of this happens in American prisons. Like these MS-13, like these are American prison gangs that get created and embedded in places like El Salvador because people get racialized in prison, where they divide you by race and basically create the gang dynamic, export people to El Salvador. Places like gangs like MS-13 become dominant in part because of their radicalization in American jails, which almost breed gang mentalities to help put the prisoners against each other in prison. And then people export those gang dynamics back into American cities that we're having to contend with. So people who can point out these dynamics, and again, training between groups that can mediate conflict by teaching Black and brown youth this story, I think can be a powerful antidote to this injected oppression that puts people against each other.
Thank you. Christina, what do you think?
I 100% agree with Lawrence that having, knowing the history of it all, it makes sense. And I think that is something that we don't, with all of the history, all of the education, all of the books are being banned, all of the things are being taken out to showcase and whitewash American history. So you don't know what you don't know. So that's kind of the hard part. So when you look at a little snippet of time in our history, just take our present time, you believe that this is what it is and has always been. This, Black people losing their jobs to Latina folks, and Latinos being violent criminals, or what's being said about them and being publicized. That's if you only look at that snippet, that's all you're going to believe. Whereas if you take the long run and take a look at how the United States was created, you have a way to center the conversation, to ground your perspective, to make and understand that this is something that was a design and not something that is one individual person against another individual person, or one group against another group, but more so it is embedded in how the United States was created. So once you kind of start seeing those bigger pictures and saying this is a systemic issue, it takes it out of this, I got to get mine before you get yours mentality. And it being having an ability to build allyship is something that is going to be necessary, and not in a kumbaya way, because I think in a kumbaya way that we could all sing a nice song together. I'm all about that. We could do that too if you want to, but that's not going to resolve the bigger issues around us. But being able to call out the issues and saying, as someone who's Latina, being like, the way you're treating Black folks, that's not right. And I have to stand up for my Black brother and sisters the same way I want them to stand up for my people too, right? But how do you get there? And I think Lawrence has some really good ways of like mediation, having people come in that know about these issues, how to talk about it, the historical perspective is a way to do that. And also, it's what's Marjorie Green or whatever her name is, another one, I don't want to say her name too much. But she recently was basically regarding the shutdown, she was basically like, oh no, I think we should extend the Obamacare tax credits. And you know why it is? Because her son's premium is going to double than what he was paying. So all of a sudden, the self-interest, someone in her family was being affected by this, gave her enough pause to be like, oh, it's happening to my son. And that's important to me. So maybe we should do this for other people too. So it's an inherent, I know Lawrence and I kind of were talking about like the selfishness in a previous conversation, is that we are people who are selfish. And somehow we have to get out of that and see the humanity in others. But that's a kumbaya moment that I don't know we're ready for in any types of anytime soon.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's just recognizing mutual self-interest. Where again, it's most of the people who were impacted in that Chicago raid, from what I can apparently tell, were Black people, Black American-born people, and there are plenty of illegal immigrants from Haiti, Dominican Republic, Africa, Cameroon, where they live. They live amongst Black people. It's, ICE being the most powerful law enforcement entity ever built in the modern era in terms of funding is going to impact us, right? And similarly, forms of political and economic redistribution, which center, political activation of working class Black and brown people to meet material needs. We may have a certain way we do things in our community. Latina people may have a certain way they do things in their community, but if the power is shifted to those folks having more resources, then we're both going to benefit. And my group doesn't have to serve a Latina community if they have better ability to serve themselves, right? And it doesn't have to be, I want all the money to serve everybody. I think most Black people don't. I think they want to serve their community. And that may mean that they're a $500,000 nonprofit as opposed to a $10 million nonprofit. And I think a lot of people are fine with that. And if that's the infrastructure we're building, I think that's partially our theory with things like the Youth Fund and the Reparations Fund for the War on Drugs, is the ability to seed those institutions distributes power to make it accessible to people on the ground who are doing work, who have political leverage to get that money. And we're competing not against each other, but against the large nonprofits that are used to monopolizing those funds and the people who benefit from those university affiliated or large nonprofits dominating that money. So that battle against the nonprofit industrial complex, I think, can unify Black and brown people who sees people hustling off of our suffering, our shared suffering, as a shared enemy. And that's not just ICE, that's Johns Hopkins, that's people potentially funded by the United Way. That's a lot of people who call themselves allies, but in this moment have been deafening in their silence around these dynamics. And it's because they want to benefit from the political arrangement where they can become the intermediaries to ameliorate some of this intense suffering, but thus become ensconced in the infrastructure that basically makes the jobs program for them a political power play for them.
So understanding that, I'm sorry, understanding that this is the moment that we're in now, right? Where those groups that would have as a framework a more culturally communal system for addressing and resolving issues in our communities, knowing that now those types of groups are being surveilled, are being criminalized, are being, talked about as if they're doing something that is so un-American that it is like literally threatening the system. In this moment, what is it that those groups that all of us can do to move this forward?
Well, in terms of the system, I think there needs to be a united front.
Mhm.
What's happening now is that people, institutions, smaller institutions that need federal money for survival are being individually plucked off. And in that plucking off, it's creating a ripple effect that the next person is like, is that going to happen to me? Or the next organization is saying, is that going to happen to me? Therefore, they will comply before even being asked to comply. And I think you see that you see it on a bigger level with like universities that are being asked to get rid of the DEI program, teach a certain way. All of the academic freedom that universities are known for, they're being asked to capitulate. And that in and of itself, if one university folds, then the other universities are then have a stronger position to fold too. Whereas if one university stands up, then the next university stands up, all of the systems could maintain essentially their power. But to Lawrence's point, those are big systems, right? Those are big, gargantuan systems. And what we're trying to get to is communities and trying to uplift and help communities stay strong and unified. And the only way to really do that is to respect and understand that communities know what they're doing at their fundamental level. They know how to take care of themselves. So we have to trust them to do that. And if we could build those bridges and say, I know, I know these communities, if we give them money, they don't need to prove to us that they did X, Y, and Z in order to use that money. Just use the money and take care of your people. So it's really changing the mindset of, I need metrics. You need to prove to me why you deserve this money. Whereas it should be more of a, here's money I trust and I know that you're going to take care of your people because they're your people. I think that's a really big difference in understanding of how our communities grow and thrive. And like there was Black Wall Street, right? Where we kind of all know about that. And they were like, well, why don't, and the whole American, like people were like, why don't you just separate and start your own thing? And it's like, well, we tried that and we didn't like that either. So, it's kind of like understanding that there is a history of things working out well when people take care of each other in community.
Thank you. Lawrence.
Yeah, I mean, just finding common interest in targeting politically institutions where that aggregation of power mutually harms communities and redistributing that power mutually benefits communities. So, I mean, I think it's one of the things where, again, we talk about philanthropy and universities. Sometimes we forget where the money comes from. And so much of that money is tied right now in AI and tech, and they have a vested interest in not upsetting fundamentally the power relations that keep enough stability for them to be able to produce their capital and get their returns. So as much as I would like to think universities and philanthropies would be emancipatory, I don't think, given their lack of democratic accountability inherent in the way that they're produced, I don't think that's going to happen. So that's why we talk so much about public institutions and public dollars, is that we do, for the moment at least, apparently have the power to leverage the vote and therefore have a degree of control over these funds. So we're looking at potentially like targeting an institution like Hopkins. Hopkins, just their money, just the money they put into the market through investment through their endowment, made $3 to $4 billion last year, right? So paying a payment in lieu of taxes of $6 to $12 million is not even peanuts. It doesn't even account for the inflation on their previous ridiculous sweetheart deal. So how do you have a conversation about taxing someone like Hopkins and explain to people that this is not Trump's vision of taxing universities, which is basically saying for Trump and them that they've gone too woke, they've surrendered to the horde, the black and brown hordes, and that they are advancing the interest of a marginalized population, which makes them woke and evil, therefore we have to punish them. The reality is that they've strategically grafted onto themselves the veneer of representing oppressed people's interests to become people who benefit from being able to politic their suffering and produce a leadership class of black and brown people who then run the system of exploitation of capitalist, racist, violent exploitation, but gives it an appearance of equity through diversity. So taxing an institution like Hopkins at a state level and redistributing those funds for things like reparations, for communities impacted by ICE, would then allow for the gaining of community capacity to address this moment when we know federal money is getting cut off. But that's the political vision that it would take to actually counter the violence at the scale at which the violence is happening. And it'll require, people challenging a potential assumptive belief in an alliance with institutions like the academy, with institutions like Hopkins that may have produced people or, been seen as a home for some people. But, the military industrial complex money that flows through Hopkins, the way they've invested in military technologies around the world, all the things about not divesting from Israel, like these are all things we know. And what would it take to actually sell that as part of a vision of politics that can unite working people, really of all races, but especially black and brown people?
Thank you. And Genevieve, and forgive me if I'm mispronouncing your name, share how you pronounce your name, and then I know that you had a question.
Thank you all. So my name is Genevieve, and it's the same as Genevieve.
Yep.
And I thank you all so much. This has been so instructive and enlightening to listen to you. So I was wondering, in the case of my small town in the area and my small police force here, do you have any advice for me on how I can talk to that town management and police force about how they can better put our money to work protecting our community rather than collaborating with larger law enforcement agencies that could endanger us? For example, is it reasonable, is it a good idea for me to ask them to be ready to arrest masked and unidentified kidnappers in town? Thank you all so much.
And where are you from? What is do you feel comfortable no, let me back up. Do you feel comfortable stating where your small town is or giving us some sense of the demographics of your
Right.
small
Let
town?
me say it's a small town in Maryland on the Beltway, and it is our largest community is Latino, and yeah, that.
Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, I would say look at don't go to the police force. The police have a vested interest in stoking fears of crime because, they feel like they can get money for this cooperation and they just believe they've been conditioned to see this as a way to secure their position, more jobs, more people in the union dues, then pay politicians, and they have strong relationships with the media. I would say look at the county executive. It's, because I believe that the county executive, they have to pass some things to the county executive and the county council to, for example, do a 287G agreement. So if you're a county executive and county council, if they haven't done one yet, making sure they don't do one, but if they have done one to cooperate with ICE and basically deputize local police, you can work to repeal it. The state has tried to basically ban 287G agreements, but that bill was basically not passed at the state level. So you can also go to your state representative to this coming session. People will reintroduce legislation basically invalidating, preempting 287G agreements by state law. And that basically an extremely watered down version of something passed last year about not facilitating people being seized in sensitive locations like schools and churches and things like that. But that was an extreme compromise from the Democratic Party leadership because they didn't want to take on the power of the chiefs and the sheriffs and Sinclair Media, Fox News, spreading this propaganda about you're unsafe, immigrants are dangerous, things like that. So I would say look at your county executive, county council, see if you have a 287G agreement. If you don't, make sure you don't get one. I would say look at your state representative, your state senator, your state delegates to see where they are on preempting 287G agreements statewide. But the last thing I would say is, again, don't isolate immigration policing from all the other forms of policing that this current moment is built upon. So if the third largest community is Latinx, then what are the embedded systems of anti-Black policing that are embedded within this police department? And then again, I would say look at the county budget and see are there things related to electronic surveillance, drones, or just particular things in the budget that you can target to make a case for shifting those funds towards things like violence prevention, towards things like alternatives to policing. And the more specific you can be there, the better. So you're not just saying defund the police, you're saying defund this specific thing and fund this specific thing instead.
Christina, do you have any additional thoughts?
The only thing I could add to that is that there's grassroots organizations that are working in communities and tapping into them as a resource. The work has been going on for a very long time. Like we said, this is a long road. So the road has been plowed, and just tap into those things, because that way you don't have to recreate the wheel. They could provide direction and support. They could make connections. Because a lot of this is about networking, let's be honest. A lot of advocacy at the Capitol, at the state level, or your community level is about networking and who you know and how you get in the room with them. So definitely tap into those organizations and those advocates who are already there.
Thank you. I want to ask you both, any final thoughts that you want to leave with us this evening?
Just want to thank you for, being here in this Monday night. Our organization, LBS, we give lots of information around the work we're doing in Annapolis. Again, we're going to hopefully release our legislative agenda in a couple of weeks that will talk about, dealing with youth charge as adults, the continued propaganda around youth crime, creating this environment where charging youth as adults, and we need to stop the automatic charging of youth as adults in Maryland. We have some of the worst statistics in the country. Again, potentially having a bill that makes Hopkins pay their fair share, not just in Baltimore, but the whole statewide, right? Actual taxation for their $13 billion endowment. And some other things related to violence prevention, reentry, and actually preventing crime so we don't feel the need to return to policing. So that's lbsbaltimore.com. We have a couple of podcasts, In Search of Black Power, which is more national, international book reviews, and Political Commentary Corner, which is more state and local politics. So both of those are available on YouTube or wherever you get podcasts. And again, if you sign up for our email blast on our website, every law in the state of Maryland passed in 100 days from January to April. We have a 100-day session. So it's very chaotic, and we need people to contact their lawmakers around these bills. So signing up for our email, we'll sign up for the email blast when it's time to put pressure on these lawmakers. They're not used to people knowing about what they're doing in Annapolis. They're used to it going under the radar. And it's very easy for it to go under the radar in this moment, given how intense things are nationally. But we really have to put pressure on these state lawmakers because they get away with extremely conservative policies under the guise of we're Democrats, we're not Trump, we're liberal. And putting pressure on them, emailing them, it's a very effective way to let people know that you see them and pushing them to make better policy choices. It doesn't feel like it means anything. Maybe at the congressional level, it doesn't mean much, but at the state level, it means a lot because it's so much fewer eyes that really has leverage that we can then use to translate that into political progress. So I thank you all, and hopefully we can have future conversations about this in the future.
And thank you, and thank LBS for the work that you all continue to do. And one of the things that we appreciate about LBS is your community focus, that you are so focused on what policies and what laws benefit the communities in which we live. And so it's not about Republican or Democrat or independent or green or whatever. It is about what policies are helping expand opportunities especially for those communities and groups who have been the most marginalized in our history and what policies don't. And we just thank you for that work. Christina, final thoughts.
My final thoughts are related to the overwhelming nature of what's happening. And I think it's easy to get overwhelmed because at this point, it's like a fire hose going 1,000%, and you're not sure what to do, where to look, how to handle it all. So what I recommend is pick one issue that you feel passionate about and work on that. And as you're working on that, think about the interconnectedness of that particular issue, just like Lawrence was saying, that most of our communities are impacted one way or another. So when you're advocating for something, think about it. Yes, I'm advocating for Latinos and the immigration status, and I'm trying to do this and that. But also say, how is this going to impact my Black brothers and sisters, and what does that look like, and how is that going to help Native Americans, or how is it going to harm them? So thinking about it, one particular issue, but think about it in a large scope, so that you're not happenstancing to oppress other groups. So it's more of a really thoughtful process. And the other thing is, give yourself grace, because sometimes we can't do everything all the time, and chances are huge and high and big deal and you're gonna mess up. Somewhere along the line, you're gonna mess up, because we are all embedded into this system. And this system has taught us all how to navigate it and enjoy its benefits, as well as recognizing how it harms us. So it's much easier to recognize how we're being harmed rather than how we're harming others, because that's something that's baked in. So taking kind of like this long approach to things that will lead to pacing, so you're not burning yourself out. Be in community, because together we could do things and survive longer in this hard work, because this is something that is going to require all of us to participate. And sometimes our colleagues, sometimes our friend or family needs to take a break. Let them take a break, but while they're taking a break, you're in action. And then it's going to be your turn to take a break, and then you want someone else to jump in. So all that to say, there's a lot of things you could do, but I would say pick one that you feel passionate about, connect with others, give yourself grace, and think of how your participation in this affects others.
I absolutely love that. And let me say that Lawrence had to go because believe it or not, he has another meeting at 7:30. But we have included the website of LBS as well as the website of BRJA in the chat for you all. Christina, thank you so much just for participating, for taking the time, for your wisdom. This whole conversation, just as you both were talking, it's made me think once again how the work that we do and the work of so many of us, because I recognize some participants, and I want to give you all your flowers and thank you all for your work too, and for your commitment too, even for your being here this evening and gracing us with your time as we all wrestle together with how we're going to meet this moment. And the thing that I continue to come back to is that our conversations at BRJA with you all are really about how do we take care of our communities, especially those who have been historically marginalized. It is about how do we continue or begin to build bridges. And as Christina says, not for the quick, cheap kumbaya moments, but the how are we going to learn how to trust enough to be ride or dies together. That we can't uphold just one thing and forget about everything else, because we all are interconnected together. So recognizing those interconnections and building those bridges are so important to the work that we all do. And it's something that we always should keep in mind as we go about doing our work, just that understanding of the interconnectedness. Also, the understanding that the US has a history and none of this stuff is new and none of it operates in isolation. None of these are standalone issues. They are issues that again connect to the history and again connect to everything else that is going on, and that it is not criminal or un-American to talk about that history, to talk about those interconnections, and to talk about how we take the learnings of that history to come up with solutions so that we don't go down that same road. How can we focus on those things that unite us and acknowledge the things that don't? The areas where we have legitimate disagreements. And if we do all of that, then knowing that we are operating for the benefit of not only our communities, but of moving forward the United States at large instead of taking it back. And when that is our focus, then every conversation that we have is the most American conversation that we can have. And it is these types of American conversations that acknowledge all of this that will help us not only survive this moment, but move us forward from it